"She will do very well in the corner, your grace," said Lady Prudence Vane, laughing behind her fan. "She is our spinster aunt, you understand, and quite invisible. One scarcely remembers she is in the room at all." The Duke of Oxley did not laugh. He stood at the edge of the great gilded ballroom of Halbury House, a glass of untouched claret in his hand, and he followed the direction of the lady's careless gesture to the far corner beneath the lowest branch of the chandelier, where a woman in grey stood very still with a fan she was not using and a face she had schooled into perfect, patient nothing. And in the whole shining, chattering, perfumed length of that room, hers was the only face he could not look away from. He had come to Halbury House to be bored. He had promised himself as much on the drive from Oxley, watching the winter fields go silver under a bruised sky, telling his own reflection in the carriage glass that he would stay 1 hour, refuse the 3 heiresses who would be pushed at him before supper, and be gone before the dancing grew tedious. Julian Ashford, 9th Duke of Oxley, was 39 years old, unmarried, by the reckoning of every mother in 3 counties, the greatest prize left unclaimed in England. He had learned to wear that knowledge the way a man wears armor he has not chosen, heavily and with his face shut. Invisible, he repeated. His voice was quiet, and the quiet of it made Lady Prudence's fan pause. "You are certain of that, madam?" "Oh, entirely, your grace." She recovered her brightness quickly. She was a handsome woman of 40, the mistress of Halbury by marriage, and she prided herself on managing rooms. "That is only Marianne Aldsworth. My husband's cousin. Poor soul, she has been with the family, 12 years now. More. She keeps the little ones and does the accounts and the flowers and heaven knows what else. Nobody courts her. Nobody ever did. She had her season once, long ago, and nothing came of it, and now she is well." The fan opened again, dismissing the woman as one dismisses a servant who has done her work. "She is useful. That is all one asks of her. That is all one asks of her." The Duke turned the phrase over as he might turn a coin found in the dust, and disliked the ring of it. He said nothing more to Lady Prudence. He inclined his head, exactly the degree politeness required and no further, and he moved away from her along the wall, and he did not go toward the corner, because he was not a man who went toward things, but he went where he could see it better. She was, as he supposed, what the world would call plain. Her gown was 3 seasons out of fashion, and had been let out and taken in more than once. He could see the ghost of an old seam. Her hair was brown, not fashionably dressed, drawn back simply, with a single silver thread at the temple, though she could not have been above 31. She wore no jewels. She was not tall. She stood with her hands folded and her shoulders straight, and while every other woman in that room performed laughing a beat too loud, tilting a chin, letting a curl fall just so, this Marianne Aldsworth performed nothing at all. She simply watched. And there was in the steadiness of that watching something the Duke had not seen in a very long while, and could not at once name. Then a small commotion cut across the music. A footman with a laden tray had caught his heel on the edge of a carpet, and the tray tipped, and a shower of little glasses and a tureen of hot punch went toward the floor, and toward the skirts of 2 young ladies who shrieked and leapt back. In the half-second before it struck, before anyone of rank had so much as turned, the woman in grey moved. She was there. The Duke did not see how she crossed the distance. One instant she was folded into a corner, and the next her 2 hands were under the tilting tray, writing it, and her body was turned to take the slop of hot punch across her own sleeve, rather than across the silk of the shrieking girls. She said something low to the footman, not a rebuke, the Duke saw, but a steadying word, for the boy's face had gone white with the terror of a servant who expects to be dismissed, and she set the tray level. And she stepped back into invisibility with a dark stain spreading down her grey arm, and not one flicker of complaint upon her face. Nobody thanked her. The 2 young ladies, safe, resumed their laughter. Lady Prudence, across the room, had seen it and looked merely annoyed, as if the near accident had been Marianne's fault for being near it. The music had not even faltered. The Duke of Oxley found that he had set down his claret. He had spent his life among people who were performing. He had been courted, flattered, hunted, and lied to since he was 22 and came into the title, and he had grown very good at seeing the machinery behind a smile. This, the quickness, the choosing to be burned rather than let a servant be blamed, the utter absence of any glance toward an audience. This was not machinery. This was character, caught unguarded, the way lightning shows you the shape of a hill. And he had learned long ago that a person is only truly themselves in the half-second before they remember they are being watched. He should have looked away then. A wiser man, the man he had trained himself to be, would have finished his hour and gone. Instead he beckoned without turning his head, and his host's son, a callow, obliging young man named Cecil Vane, materialized at his elbow, pink with the honor of being noticed. "Your Grace, the lady in grey," said the Duke. "Present me." Young Cecil's mouth opened and shut. That is only my cousin Marianne, Your Grace. Aunt Marianne, we call her, though she is not truly, that is, she is a poor relation, she doesn't dance, he floundered, seeing the Duke's face, which had not changed, and which had a way of not changing that had reduced better men than Cecil Vane to silence. "Of course. At once, Your Grace." The Duke crossed the ballroom. He was aware, as he went, of the room reorganizing itself around his passage, of heads turning, of fans stilling, of 3 mothers straightening 3 daughters like a gardener straightening staked roses, of the whole glittering apparatus of the marriage market swinging its hopeful cannon to bear on the Duke of Oxley, who so rarely walked anywhere in company at all. He was used to it. He ignored it. He walked to the corner beneath the lowest branch of the chandelier, and the woman in grey saw him coming, and for the first time that evening something crossed her face that was not perfect patient nothing. It was not the thing he had seen 100 times on 100 hopeful faces. It was not calculation, and it was not triumph, and it was not that particular hunger the sight of him usually kindled. It was something almost like dismay, as if she had been comfortable being invisible and he had committed the small cruelty of seeing her. "Miss Aldsworth," said Cecil, breathless, arriving astride ahead of the Duke. "May I? That is the Duke of Oxley desires the honour, the Duke of Oxley, Marianne." "I heard you, Cecil," she said, and her voice was low and even and entirely her own, with a dryness under it that the Duke caught at once, the way you catch a scent of wood smoke on cold air. She curtsied correctly, gracefully, without a scrape of civility, and when she rose her eyes came up to his, clear and grey and steady, and they did not flinch and they did not flatter. "Your Grace," she said, "you have chosen the least interesting person in the room. I hope you will not find the mistake too tedious to unmake." Cecil made a strangled sound. Somewhere behind the Duke, a fan snapped shut. The Duke of Oxley looked down at Marianne Aldsworth, at the stain of hot punch drying on her grey sleeve, at the silver thread in her brown hair and the level, unfrightened set of her mouth, and he felt something that he had believed, quite genuinely, that he was too old and too tired and too well-armoured ever to feel again. It moved in his chest like a door opening in a house he had thought long shut up. "On the contrary, Miss Aldsworth," he said, "I begin to suspect I have found the only interesting person in it. Will you walk with me? There is too much music here, and I should like to hear you speak where I can attend to it." She did not simper and she did not refuse. She studied him for the length of one breath, weighing him, he realized, the way she had weighed the falling tray, deciding in half a second what a thing was and what it required. Then she laid her stained grey sleeve upon his offered arm, lightly, as though she did not quite believe the arm would remain there, and she let the Duke of Oxley lead her out of her corner and across the whole watching length of Howbury House. The room did not resume its chatter. It held its breath, and in the sudden brittle silence, quite clearly, from the direction of Lady Prudence Vane, a single incredulous whisper carried across the polished floor. "The spinster, aunt?" The Duke heard it. He felt the woman on his arm hear it too, felt the small, familiar stiffening of a person long accustomed to being spoken of as furniture. He did not slow his step, but he tightened his arm very slightly over her hand, and he bent his head, and he said, so that only she could hear it, "Let them wonder, Miss Aldsworth. I find I have grown very tired of a world that mistakes silence for emptiness. Tell me, for I already know what they think of you. What is it that you think of them?" And for the first time that whole long glittering evening, in the corner of her mouth where all her patience lived, Marianne Aldsworth almost smiled. They walked the length of the long gallery that ran off the ballroom, where the noise of the party thinned to a murmur behind them, and the candle sconces threw their 2 shadows tall, and joined against the ports of dead veins. The Duke had asked his question and then, deliberately, had let the silence stand. He had learned that a silence offered without pressure was the surest way to hear what a person truly was. Most people rushed to fill it with flattery. Mary Ann Aldsworth walked 3 paces with her hand light on his arm and let it stand as easily as he did. "You wish to know what I think of them," she said at last. "You should not ask that, Your Grace. I am dependent upon their charity." A dependent woman who speaks her mind is a luxury the world does not permit her, and I have learned to be economical. "I am not the world," said the Duke. "No," she agreed, and there was that dry thread under her voice again. "You are considerably richer than it, which makes your good opinion both more dangerous and less trustworthy. Men who have never wanted for anything are seldom kind by habit. They are kind by whim. And a whim is a poor thing to build a life beside." She said it not bitterly, but as a plain report, the way she might have reported the state of the accounts, and the Duke, who had been flattered by experts for 17 years, felt the plainness of it go through him like cold water on a hot day. "You think me a man of whims. I think you are a man who came to a party to be bored," she said, "and found a novelty in the corner. Novelties are enjoyed and then set down. I've been set down before, Your Grace, more times than I could count, and I have made a study of not minding it. I would rather not be picked up again, only to learn the lesson twice." He stopped walking. She stopped too, and looked up at him. And he saw that she had said this thing that cost her something, that under the dry economy there was a woman who had been picked up and set down, and had built her steadiness out of the wreck of it, and that she had said it anyway, because she would rather be thought impertinent than be deceived. The Duke of Oxlade had commanded the respect of Parliament and the fear of half the peerage, and no one in 17 years had spoken to him with so little arrangement. "Tell me how you came here," he said. "To this family." 12 years, Lady Prudence said. Something in the frank grey eyes shuttered, briefly, and then opened again on a decision. 13, in truth. I was 18. My father was a clergyman of small living and small ascents. When he died there were depths and no sun, and my mother did not long outlast him. The Vanes are my mother's people. They took me in, which was, I will say for them, more than they were obliged to do, and they gave me a bed and my keep, and in exchange I made myself useful, because a poor relation who is not useful is only a burden, and a burden is not kept long. She lifted one shoulder, a small economical movement. I raised the children, Cecil and his sisters, and now Cecil's own little ones when they come to stay. I kept the household books when Lady Prudence found figures tedious. I did the flowers because I liked them and no one else troubled to. I was at the beginning allowed 1 season, because it would have looked ill to keep a girl of 18 entirely out of society. I had a plain gown and no dory and a sharp tongue I had not yet learned to hide, and I received no offers, and after that it was decided not unkindly, you understand, merely as a matter of arithmetic, that I would not marry, and that being so, I might make myself the more useful at home. And you accepted this arithmetic. I am not a fool, Your Grace. A woman without money or beauty who insists upon her own consequence only makes herself ridiculous, and I had learned by then that being ridiculous is a great deal worse than being invisible. She looked away at a portrait of some long-dead Vane in a ruff. Invisible, one is at least at peace. One is not looked at, and so one is not laughed at, and one may keep one's own thoughts as a kind of private country that no one can tax or take. I have a great many thoughts, Your Grace. I have simply learned to have them quietly. The Duke was silent a moment. He was thinking of his own great house at Oxley, of its 200 rooms and its silence, of the way he too had learned to keep his thoughts as a private country, because every word he spoke aloud was weighed and repeated, and turned to someone's advantage. He was thinking that this woman, who had nothing, and he who had everything, had arrived at the very same fortress by opposite roads, and had furnished it identically, with silence, and with the refusal to be known. The children, he said. You said you raised them. Do they love you? For the first time her composure moved, not broke, but softened, the way a hard winter light softens toward evening. The little ones do, she said. Children have no notion of consequence. They do not know I am a poor relation. They only know I am the one who comes when they cry in the night, and who knows the stories, and who does not scold them for muddy boots. Cecil loved me once when he was small. He is ashamed of me now, which is what the world teaches boys to feel for the women who raise them and cannot advance them. I do not blame him." She paused. "I find, your grace, that I am telling you a great deal. I do not know why. I do not tell anyone anything." "I think you have simply not, as a rule, been asked," said the Duke. And then, because he was a man who had spent his life speaking carefully and was suddenly, strangely weary of it, "Miss Aldsworth, I am going to say a thing to you that will sound like a whim, and you will distrust it, and you will be right too, and I am going to say it anyway. In 20 years of assemblies precisely like this one, I have not once wished to know the mind of any person in the room. I have wished to leave. I have wished the evening over. I have never, until an hour ago, wished to stay. That is not flattery. I have no reason to flatter you and every reason of prudence not to. It is only the truth, and I have grown to prize the truth so highly, and to encounter it so rarely, that when I find it I am unwilling to walk away from it merely because it is inconvenient." She looked at him for a long moment, and he watched her weigh him again, and he found that he wanted, absurdly with an intensity that unsettled him, to be found not wanting. "You are either the most dangerous man I have ever met," she said slowly, "or the loneliest. I have not yet decided which." "They are frequently the same man, Miss Aldsworth." That surprised a real breath of laughter out of her, short, low, quickly suppressed, but real, and the sound of it did something to the Duke of Oxley that no heiress's practised laugh had ever done. He resolved in that moment, standing in the cold gallery among the dead veins, that he would see this woman again and again, and that he did not much care what the world made of it. They returned to the ballroom because they must. A longer absence would have been remarked, and he would not have her remarked upon to her cost. But at the door he paused, and he said, "I ride out most mornings when I am in the country. Oxley is not 15 miles from here. Do you ever walk in the mornings, Miss Aldsworth? There is a stretch of the Halbury Road past the old milestone, where the frost lies on the beaches, that I am told is very fine." She understood him. He watched her understand, watched her consider the impropriety, the danger, the near certain grief it would cost her if it were discovered, and then he watched her lift her chin, that small brave habitual lift, and answer him plainly, "I walk most mornings, your grace, when the children can spare me. I have found that no one troubles to ask a spinster aunt where she has been. It is one of the few freedoms of being invisible." She curtsied. "I bid you good evening," and she went back to her corner beneath the lowest branch of the chandelier, and folded her hands, and became once more the useful, overlooked, unregarded thing the room believed her to be, except that the Duke of Oxley, watching from the doorway with his face shut and his heart, for the first time in a decade, entirely unguarded, now knew better. He knew what lightning had shown him. And he was already quietly, without saying so even to himself, beginning to rearrange the whole architecture of his careful life to make a place in it for the woman in grey. He did not stay for supper. He made his bow to Lady Prudence, who was flushed with the triumph of having had the Duke of Oxley under her roof, and full of plans already for how she might parade her own eligible connections before him, and he said all the correct nothings, and he took his leave. In the carriage, rolling home through the black winter lanes with the lamp swinging, he did not think, as he had expected to, of how tedious the evening had been. He thought of a stain of hot punch on a grey sleeve, and a footman's frightened face steadied by a low kind word, and a voice that said, "You are either the most dangerous man I have ever met or the loneliest," and he found that he was smiling into the dark, alone, like a much younger and much less careful man. The frost lay on the beaches exactly as he had been told it would, and the Duke of Oxley, who had risen before his valet and ridden out into a grey-pink dawn like a man half his age, was waiting at the old milestone when Marianne Aldsworth came walking up the Halbury Road with her breath smoking in the cold and a wicker basket on her arm. She was not surprised to see him. He could tell that she had spent the walk deciding whether he would be there, and that some part of her had hoped he would not, because his being there made a thing real that was safer left possible. She wore the same grey cloak, mended at the hem, and her cheeks were whipped pink by the wind, and she looked, in the flat, clean morning light, with no chandelier to make her plain by comparison, not plain at all. She looked alive. The Duke, who had spent 17 years being wanted for his title and his acres, discovered that he wanted, with a plainness that frightened him a little, only to make her look alive like that every morning for the rest of his life. "You came," she said. "You doubted it." "I hoped against it," she admitted, which was so exactly the truth he had guessed that he laughed aloud, and the sound startled a rook out of the bare beeches. A duke who keeps a morning appointment with a poor relation on a frost-bitten road is a duke who means something by it, and I had rather he meant nothing. Nothing is survivable. Something is not. You are very concerned with survival, Miss Aldsworth. I have had to be. It is a great luxury, Your Grace, to be able to consider anything else. But she fell into step beside him, and the basket swung on her arm, and they walked the frost-white avenue of beeches together, and she told him when he asked that the basket held broth and physic for a cottager's wife down with a lung fever, that she carried such baskets 3 mornings in a week, that the Halbury tenants knew her far better than the Halbury family did and asked after her at church, and that this, the walking, the baskets, the being of use to people who did not despise her for being useful was the part of her life she would not have traded even for a dowry. The Duke listened. He was not accustomed to listening. He was accustomed to being listened to. But he found in her account of the tenants a competence and a compassion so unforced that he began, quietly, to see the shape of what she might be if she were ever unbound from the small cruel arithmetic that had shrunk her. He had known great ladies who ran great households. He had never known one who carried her own baskets in the frost and knew the names of the children in the cottages. He said as much. "Great ladies have stewards to carry baskets," she said, "and are the better for it, no doubt, and the tenants are none the worse. It is only that I have nothing else to give, Your Grace, and a person must give something, or she becomes merely a mouth that eats and a body that takes up a bed, and I could not bear to be that. So I carry baskets. It is not virtue. It is appetite. I am hungry to matter, and this is the only food they will let me have. I am hungry to matter." The Duke was quiet a long while after that. They came to the cottage, and he waited by the gate with the horses while she went in, and through the small window he watched her sit by the sick woman's bed and take a chapped hand in both of hers and speak low, and he watched the sick woman's face turn toward the way a plant turns toward the light, and he thought, "She has been starving in the middle of a full house for 13 years, and no one has troubled to notice, and I could feed her for a lifetime with what I let rot in my cellars, and the world would call me mad for it." And he found that he did not care what the world would call him. He had spent 17 years doing precisely what the world called wise, and the world had rewarded him with 200 empty rooms and a silence he had mistaken for peace. They walked back together as the sun burned the frost off the beeches. At the milestone, where the road forked toward Halbury and she must go on alone, she stopped. "Your Grace," she said, "I am going to say something plain, because plainness is the only currency I have, and I would rather spend it than pretend I have gold. This cannot go anywhere. You know that as well as I do. You are the Duke of Oxley. When you marry, and you must marry, you have a title and an estate that require it. You will marry a girl of 18 with £30,000 and a father in the Lords, because that is what dukes do, and it is right that they should, and I will not be so vain or so foolish as to imagine otherwise. I am 31. I have no money and no name and a face that no one ever looked at twice until you looked at it out of boredom. If I let myself," she stopped. Her chin lifted. "If I let myself grow accustomed to being seen by you, then when you stop, and you will stop, I will have to learn to be invisible all over again. And it took me 13 years to learn it the first time, and I have not the years to spare to learn it twice. So I am asking you, as a kindness, to be bored again. Go home. Marry your heiress. Let me keep my corner. It is a small dark corner, but it is mine, and I have made it comfortable, and I would rather keep it than be given a palace I must one day give back." The Duke of Oxley looked at her for a long moment in the melting frost. Then he said quite steadily, "Miss Aldsworth, I am going to tell you what I have decided, and you are free to disbelieve it, but I will tell you nonetheless. I do not intend to marry an heiress. I have refused a great many of them, over a great many years, for reasons I could not have named until 3 days ago. I understand now what I was waiting for. I was waiting to want to stay. I have wanted to leave every room I have entered since I was 22, until I entered a ballroom and saw a woman in grey take a scald on her own arm rather than let a servant be blamed, and did not glance once to see who was watching. I have not wanted to leave a room since. I want to stay in whatever room you are in. That is not boredom, Marianne. Whatever else it may prove to be, it is the plain opposite of boredom, and I am too old to mistake the one for the other. He had used her name. He saw her hear it. He saw the careful fortress she had built over 13 years tremble at the foundation, saw her want, with a naked wanting she could not quite hide fast enough, to believe him, and then he saw her deliberately, bravely, out of pure self-protection, refuse to. "You will forgive me, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was not quite steady now, "if I decline to stake 13 years of hard-won peace on 3 days of a duke's novelty. Prove it. Not with words, you have a great many words, and they are cheap even when they are true. Prove it with time. Come to the milestone in a month if you still wish to stay. Come to it in the spring, if you are still here, when the frost is off the beaches for good, and the heiresses have paraded past you all season, and you have not married one, then perhaps I will believe you mean something by it, but not now. Now you may be only a lonely man in love with the idea of an honest woman, and I have been a symbol before, Your Grace, and it is a cold thing to be. I would rather be nothing to you than a symbol." She curtsied and turned and walked away up the Hulbury Road, and did not look back, though he saw, from the set of her shoulders, exactly what it cost her not to. The Duke of Oxley rode home 15 miles with her challenge ringing in him like a struck bell, and by the time the great grey face of Oxley rose before him out of its bare park, he had understood that she had not refused him. She had done something far rarer and far braver. She had asked him to be worthy of her, and had walked away rather than let him buy her cheap. And he thought, dismounting in his own vast echoing courtyard, that in 17 years no one had ever once asked him to be worthy of anything, because no one had ever believed he might not already be. It was, he realized, the first honest gift anyone had given him since he came into the title. He meant to be equal to it. What neither of them knew that bright melting morning at the milestone was that they had been seen. A Halberry groom exercising a horse along the far hedge had marked the Duke of Oxley's own bay standing at the old milestone, and the poor relation walking up to it, and the two of them talking close for the better part of an hour with no chaperone in sight. And a groom's tongue is a cheap and busy thing, and by noon the tale was in the Halberry kitchens, and by supper it had climbed the back stairs to Lady Prudence Vane's dressing-room, where it fell into the ears of a woman who had spent a sleepless week furious that the greatest prize in England had walked out of her ballroom on the arm of the family drudge, and who now saw in the drudge not a joke, but a rival, and not a rival merely, but a theft, and who resolved, brushing out her hair before her glass with hard vicious strokes, that whatever the Duke of Oxley imagined he had found in the corner of her ballroom, she would see it broken and shamed, and put back in its corner where it belonged, before the season was a month older. The books were how they truly came to know each other, in those first weeks before the world intruded more, even, than the walks, for on the walks there was always the cold and the basket and the caution of being seen, but in the books there was no caution at all. The Duke of Oxley had a library at Oxley that his grandfather had assembled and his father had neglected, and he himself had scarcely opened in 17 years, 3,000 volumes gone quietly to dust behind their glass, and it occurred to him, after their second or third meeting at the milestone, that here was a thing he possessed in abundance, which the woman he was coming to love possessed not at all, and hungered for above almost anything. So he began to send her books. He did it discreetly at first, by a trusted groom wrapped in plain paper, with no note, a volume of history. He thought she might, a book of the newer poetry, a philosophical essay that had lately been much argued over in the clubs. And Marianne read them. Half the night by candle ends she still saved out of old habit, though he had begged her to burn as many candles as she pleased, and she sent them back, and this was the thing that undid the Duke of Oxley entirely, with her own thoughts written small and clear in the margins. He had not expected the margins. He had expected, if he had thought about it at all, gratitude, perhaps a shy word of thanks. Instead, he opened the returned history to find, beside a famous historian's confident account of a famous battle, in a firm small hand, "This is nonsense. He was not there." And the man who was there tells it quite differently. See the letters of the general's own aide, which the family suppressed because they did not flatter. And beside a celebrated poet's celebrated stanza, very pretty and entirely false. No one who had ever truly grieved wrote of grief so tidily. Grief is not tidy, it is a house one keeps finding new rooms in. And beside the fashionable philosopher whom all the clubs admired, he has never in his life gone hungry, or he could not write this. Hunger is not a lesson in virtue, it is only hunger, and the well-fed should not moralize it. The Duke of Oxley sat in his dusty library with these margins under his hand and laughed aloud, alone for the sheer joy of them, laughed as he had not laughed in 20 years. And then he did a thing he had never once done in his adult life. He took up his own pen and argued back. He wrote his own thoughts in the margins beneath hers, defending the historian, defending the poet, and sent the books again. And she answered again, routing him here, conceding there, granting him a point with a grudging fairness that pleased him more than any flattery, disagreeing with him elsewhere so acutely that he found himself pacing his own library at midnight composing rebuttals. They carried on, through those weeks, a whole second courtship in the margins of borrowed books, a courtship of minds, conducted in a small clear hand and his own bolder one, in which neither of them performed, neither flattered, neither pretended to agree where they did not. And it was, the Duke of Oxley came to understand, the most intimate thing that had ever happened to him, more intimate than any embrace, for a man may embrace a woman he does not know at all. But he cannot argue honestly, night after night, in the margins of a book, with a woman he does not somewhere love. He learned the shape of her mind that way, and it was a finer mind than any he had encountered in the Lords or the clubs or the great houses of England, undisciplined by tutors, untaught by any master, but original and honest and unafraid, forged in 12 years of thinking alone in the dark, because thinking was the one country no one could tax or take from her. She had read, he discovered, more widely than most men of his acquaintance who had been to the universities. She had thought harder about what she read, because she had had to steal the reading and so valued it, and she had come to conclusions that were entirely her own, owing nothing to fashion or party or the opinion of anyone, because she had had no one whose opinion she was obliged to court. He found in her, in short, the one thing his rank and his fortune had made nearly impossible for him to find anywhere else, an equal who owed him nothing and told him the truth. And she, for her part, he saw this too in the margins. In the slow warming of her written voice from warreness toward something freer, she was discovering the reverse, that here was a man who did not want her silence, or her usefulness, or her deference, but her actual thoughts, the private country she had guarded for 12 years, and who valued them, and argued with them as though they mattered, as though she mattered. No one had ever wanted her thoughts. The world had wanted her hands, for the accounts and the children and the flowers, and had wanted her silence, and had wanted her invisible. Her thoughts it had never asked for and would not have known what to do with. And here was the greatest prize in England, sending her the newer poetry by a groom in plain paper and staying up past midnight to disagree with her in the margins, as if her disagreement were the most precious thing he owned. It frightened her, as everything about him frightened her, because it was so exactly the thing she had wanted and had taught herself not to want. But it also slowly, against all her defences, began to thaw the long frost in her, until one morning at the milestone she found herself telling the Duke of Oxley a thought she had never told a living soul, a small, foolish, private hope she had carried since girlhood, and found that he received it gravely and gently and did not laugh, and she understood, walking home, that she had given him something she had never given anyone, and that the giving had not cost her the thing itself, as she had always feared it would, but had somehow made her richer for the sharing. It was a discovery so novel to a woman who had spent 12 years hoarding her own soul in the dark for safekeeping that she stopped in the middle of the Halbury Road and stood still a long moment, marvelling, the empty basket on her arm, the beeches greening over her head, and then she walked on, and did not know that she was, for the first time in a dozen years, entirely and simply happy, until she was nearly home, and named the strange warm feeling to herself, and was almost afraid of it. The Duke kept every book she returned. He did not shelve them back with the others. He set them apart, on a shelf by his own chair, the volumes with her small hand in the margins, and in the dark days that were coming, the 9 days among the poisoned letters, he would take one down and read her margins and be unable, quite, to reconcile the honest, fearless mind in those margins with the schema the letters described, and it would be one of the small, persistent wrongnesses that at last, with old Hartley's question, would open his eyes. But that was still to come. For now there were only the books and the margins and the two lonely, guarded, brilliant people discovering, across the borrowed pages, that they'd each spent a whole armored life keeping their real selves in a locked room, and that the other one held, impossibly, the key. In the weeks that followed the card party where she had sung, the Duke of Oxley set himself, quietly and with the patience of a man who had all his life, and none of his fear left to guide him, to learn the whole of Marianne Aldsworth's 12 years, not the version the family told, in which she was a useful drudge who had never come to anything, but the true version, which no one had ever troubled to assemble, because no one had ever thought it worth the assembling. He learned it in pieces. He learned some of it from her, on their morning walks, when she let a thing slip and he caught it and turned it gently over. He learned more of it from the tenants, who spoke of her freely once they saw that the great Duke wished to hear her praised. And he learned the rest of it from old servants, and older parish registers, and the plain evidence of his own attentive eyes, until at last he held in his mind a portrait of a life that made his chest ache with a mixture of tenderness and a slow cold anger at the world that had let it happen. She had come to Halbury at 18, he learned, in the same week that Cecil's eldest sister was born, and the infant's nurse had fallen ill of a fever within the month and died, and it had been Marianne, herself scarcely more than a girl, grieving her own dead parents, who had risen in the nights to the crying child because no one else would, and had gone on rising night after night, year after year, through the births of 3 more, until there was no hour of any Halbury child's early life that had not, at some point, been steadied by her hands. She had taught them their letters. She had nursed them through the measles and the whooping cough, sitting up whole weeks together while their mother took the waters at Bath for her nerves. She had made, out of the raw, untutored material of 4 spoiled and frightened little creatures, 4 passably decent human beings, and had watched, as each in turn grew old enough to understand the world's rankings, each in turn learned to be a little ashamed of her, and had gone on loving them anyway, and asking nothing, because a poor relation who asks is a poor relation soon dismissed. The accounts the Duke learned she had taken over in her 3rd year, when the estate steward proved a drunkard and a thief, and the family, too proud to admit they had been robbed, needed someone clever and discreet and cheap to set the books right. Marianne had set them right. She had. In fact, the Duke saw this plainly when his own man of business, at his request, looked over certain Halbury ledgers Marianne had once shown him with a shy pride. She instantly suppressed. She had saved the Vane estate from ruin, twice, by economies and small shrewd managements that the family had accepted as their due and never once acknowledged. The very silks Lady Prudence wore, the very candles that blazed at her balls, were paid for out of the labour of the woman she seated below the salt. The Duke of Oxley, who commanded one of the great fortunes of England and had never in his life balanced a book, looked at those ledgers and felt something close to reverence, and something close to shame, and resolved anew that whatever it cost him, he would not leave this woman in that house. And he learned the smaller things which moved him most of all. He learned that she gave away in secret nearly the whole of the tiny allowance the family doled her, that the broth and the physic in her baskets were bought with her own few shillings, not the family's, that she had, for 11 years, worn the same 3 gowns let out and taken in and turned and mended, so that she might spend her pin money on a dying cottager's medicine or a poor child's shoes. He learned that she read half the night by a single candle end saved from the housekeeper's store, because the family did not think a spinster aunt needed candles, and that she had taught herself French and a little Latin and a great deal of history out of the neglected Halbury library after the household slept. He learned that she had once, years ago, refused an offer of marriage, the only true offer she had ever had, from a widowed farmer of comfortable means who admired her because he had wanted a mother for his children and a manager for his dairy, and had said so plainly, and Marianne, poor as she was and with every reason to take him, had looked at the bargain and quietly declined it, telling the astonished man that she had been useful for nothing all her life, and would rather remain useful for nothing than be married for it. She would take love or she would take nothing. And the world had heard of it, and had laughed, and had said it only proved the spinster's ridiculous vanity that a penniless plain woman of 26 should turn away a respectable offer over so foolish a thing as love. The Duke of Oxley did not think it foolish. He thought it the bravest thing he had ever heard. He who could have had any bargain in England had refused them all for the same reason and been called merely eccentric, because a rich man may refuse and be thought fastidious. A poor woman who refuses is thought mad. And he understood then, fully, what she had meant at the milestone when she said, "I would rather be nothing to you than a symbol." She had lived her whole life declining to be a thing that was used. She had declined the farmer, declined the family's assumption that she would marry beneath her out of gratitude, declined every small offered dignity that came with the price of being less than a whole person. She had kept nothing but her own soul, and she had kept that entire in a corner in the dark for 12 years. And she would not now trade it, not even for a duke, unless the duke wanted the soul and not the using of it. He carried all of this home with him and sat with it in the long evenings, and it changed something in him that went deeper than desire. He had begun at that first ball by being fascinated by the quickness of her, the unperformed truth of her. But fascination is a shallow water. What grew in him now, as he came to know the whole shape of her 12 years, was something with roots, a profound and steadying admiration, the recognition of a courage larger than his own, the humbling knowledge that this overlooked woman had done, quietly and without reward, a harder and finer thing than he had ever been asked to do. He had inherited his greatness. She had made hers, out of nothing, in the dark, where no one clapped, and the Duke of Oxley, who had been the most desired man in England for 17 years and had found nothing in it worth staying for, understood at last that he had spent all that time looking for exactly this, and had been looking in all the wrong rooms in the bright ones, among the performers, when the only real thing had been standing all along in a corner in mended grey, saving other people's estates and other people's children and asking for nothing at all. He wrote to her that night. He did not send it by the discreet servant who carried their books. He sent it openly, sealed with the Oxley arms, and he did not care who saw. It was a short letter. It said, "I have learned this fortnight the whole account of your 12 years. I did not know a person could be so long unpaid for so much good. I mean to spend the remainder of my life correcting the arithmetic. You asked me to prove myself with time. I ask only that you let me have the time. Yours, in a way I have never before signed a letter and mean now entirely Julian." He did not know, sending it, that the letter would sit unanswered for a fortnight, because in the fortnight between its sending and any hope of its answer, Lady Prudence Vane's blue silk and her false new warmth and her hired smooth man and her waiting snare would close over Marianne Aldsworth like water over a stone, and the Duke of Oxley, for all his love and all his resolve, would walk straight into the trap that had been laid across his path, and fail her and leave her at the milestone in the young spring frost. But that was still to come. For now, sealing the letter with the Oxley arms, the Duke of Oxley was as near to simple happiness as he had been in his whole guarded life, and he slept that night, for the first time in 20 years, without the armour on. Lady Prudence Vane was a woman of resource, and she did not waste her fury. She invested it. Within the fortnight she had contrived to have the Duke of Oxley invited to a succession of dinners, a shooting party, a musical evening, each engineered so that Marianne should be either kept from the room entirely, on some pretext of household need, or exhibited in her worst light, seated below the salt, sent to fetch and carry before the very guest whose good opinion she was suspected of stealing. And when the Duke came, as he did come, to every one of these gatherings, Lady Prudence set her prettiest connections before him like dishes at a feast. Her niece Arabella, 17 and goldened, empty as a bell. The Honourable Miss Fanshawe with her £40,000. A viscount's daughter with a laugh like breaking glass. The Duke of Oxley endured them all. He was courteous, because he had been bred to courtesy, because he would not give Lady Prudence the satisfaction of a scene, but he was courteous the way a granite cliff is courteous to the sea. And the golden girls broke on him and slid away. and each evening his dark eyes found, sooner or later, the one grey figure at the edge of the room or the one empty chair where she should have been, and each evening Lady Prudence watched him find it. And her hatred cooled from a fire into something patient and hard. He met Marianne at the milestone when he could not every morning now, for she had been given, all at once, a great deal more work than a household truly needed, and he understood the strategy of it and said nothing, because to name it would be to make her defend herself, and he would not put her to that. But when they met he did not press her, he kept to her terms. He proved it, as she had asked, with time. A month passed and another, and the frost went from the beeches and came back and went again, and the Duke of Oxley did not marry an heiress, and did not tire, and did not stop coming to the milestone. And slowly, the way ice goes out of a river not in a moment but in a long grinding season of small releases, Marianne Aldsworth began, against every instinct of self-preservation she possessed, to believe him. She began to laugh more easily. She began to bring him small things she had found on her walks, a curl of birch bark, a jay's blue feather, a bit of old Roman tile turned up in a cottager's garden, not as gifts, she insisted, merely as things that had interested her and might interest him. And the Duke received each one as though it were a jewel and kept them, all of them, in a drawer of his own writing desk at Oxley, where his valet found them and told no one. She began to speak to him of the books she had read in stolen hours in the Halbury Library, and the Duke, who had a very fine and very neglected library of his own, found himself sending her volumes by a discreet servant, and receiving back marginal notes in a small clear hand that argued with him, disagreed with him, occasionally routed him entirely, and delighted him beyond anything he could remember. He had never in his life been argued with by someone who wanted nothing from him. It was, he found, the most intimate thing that ever happened to him. And then, on a soft grey evening in the young spring, at a card party Lady Prudence had convened for the express purpose of humiliating her, Marianne Aldsworth was made to stand up and sing. It was a trap, and everyone in the room understood it to be a trap except, at first, the Duke, Lady Prudence. All sweetness had declared that dear Marianne must not sit out the music. Dear Marianne, who did so much, must be given her turn, and had insisted, over Marianne's low and level refusals, that she come to the pianoforte, knowing, as the whole family knew, that Marianne did not sing, that she had no accomplishment of that showy kind, that she would stand exposed before the Duke of Oxley and the golden heiresses, and be revealed at last as what Lady Prudence needed him to see, a plain, dull, penniless drudge with nothing to recommend her. A woman he could only ever have noticed by mistake. Arabella tittered behind her hand. Miss Fanshawe examined her rings. And Marianne, cornered, her face gone very still and very pale, walked to the pianoforte, because to refuse further would be to make a scene and give them the satisfaction of her distress. The Duke half rose. He would have stopped it, he would have crossed the room and offered his arm and walked her out, consequences be hanged, but she caught his eye, one swift grey glance, and it said, as clearly as speech, "Do not. This is mine to bear." And so he sat, every muscle in him rigid, and watched the woman he loved be led to the slaughter for the amusement of her betters. She did not sit at the instrument. She had no music by heart. She could not accompany herself. She simply stood straight-backed, one hand resting on the pianoforte's edge, and she waited for the room's cruel expectant hush, and then into it, with no accompaniment at all, in a low, clear, unadorned voice that had never been trained and never needed to be, she sang. It was an old song, plain old country song of the sort the cottagers sang, that she had learned, carrying her baskets, a ballad of a soldier gone for years, and a woman who waited and was told to give him up and would not, and waited through the turning of the seasons, until he came home over the same road he had left by. She sang it without ornament and without apology, in the voice of a woman who knew exactly what it was to wait a long time for something the world had told her would never come, and the room, which had gathered to laugh, did not laugh. The tittering stopped. Arabella's foolish face went slack. Even Lady Prudence, whose trap this was, sat frozen with her sweet false smile curdling on her lips, because she had reckoned on a drudge with a cracked and tuneless voice. And instead the whole soft-lit room had gone still and ashing under the plain true sorrow of a woman singing about being made to wait. The Duke of Oxley did not move. He sat with his hands loose on his knees and his careful shut face entirely, helplessly open, and he understood that she was not singing to the room, she was singing to him. She was telling him in the only unanswerable way left to a woman who had asked him to prove himself with time. She was telling him that she had begun to wait for him, that against all her hard-won wisdom she had let the door of her small dark corner stand open, that she was, last, hoping. And the courage it took to stand undefended before the people who despised her and pour out, in the guise of an old ballad, the hope she had spent 10 years learning not to feel struck the Duke of Oxley with a force that no cannon of Parliament had ever managed. When the last low note fell into the silence, he found that his eyes were wet, and he did not trouble to hide it. The room broke into a startled, uneven applause, the applause of people ashamed of themselves and not quite sure why. Marianne inclined her head once and walked back to her seat with her chin level and her hands not quite steady, and did not look at the Duke, because she had said everything and could not have borne to see whether he had understood. He understood. He rose into the buzzing, unsettled room. Before Lady Prudence could recover the reins of her own party, the Duke of Oxley crossed the floor, and he stopped before Marianne Aldsworth's chair, and he bowed to her a full bow, the bow one duke gives another. The bow the greatest prize in England had never in living memory given to any woman in any room, and he said, in a voice pitched to carry to every corner, Miss Aldsworth, that is the finest thing I have heard sung in 20 years of far grander rooms than this. I am in your debt for it. Will you do me the honor of walking with me? The room made a sound like a held breath let go. And Lady Prudence Vane, watching her trap close upon herself, understood at last that mockery and exposure would never serve to break this thing, that the woman she despised had a quality the Duke prized above beauty and fortune both, and that no amount of humiliation would make him blind to it. She would need a colder weapon, she would need a lie. The county could not, of course, leave so extraordinary a thing alone. That the Duke of Oxley, who had for 17 years declined the loveliest and richest girls in England with a courtesy that froze the marrow, should be seen, again and again, singling out the Halberry spinster aunt, was a scandal and a wonder, and the whole subject of every drawing-room in 3 shires. The theories multiplied. He was ill, some said, and not in his right mind. Grief for his mother, long dead, had unsettled him at last. He had lost a fortune at play, said others, and meant to marry economy. The unkindest said the drudge had bewitched him with low arts, though what low arts a woman of 31 in a mended gown might command, no one troubled to specify. The kindest and the fewest said simply that the Duke had seen something the rest of them had missed, and that perhaps the rest of them ought to be ashamed, but these were quickly hushed, for a county that has been shown up does not care to dwell on it. The Duke bore the talk as he bore everything, with a shut face and a straight back, and he did not deign to answer any of it, which only fed it the more, but he was careful, more careful than he had ever been of anything of what the talk might cost Marianne, for he understood, as she had told him at the milestone, that a duke may be eccentric where a poor woman may only be ruined, and that every hour of his attention that lifted him in the county's estimation to a romantic figure sank her in it to a schemer. And so he did a thing that cost his pride, but that he judged necessary. He called, formally and openly, upon the head of the Vane family, on Sir Marmaduke Vane, Lady Prudence's mild and henpecked husband, and he stated his intentions plainly. He did not do it well, or rather he did it too well, too coldly, too much like a treaty, because he had never in his life courted anyone and did not know how, and because the old armour was not yet off and made him formal where he wished to be warm. He told Sir Marmaduke that his attentions to Miss Aldsworth were honourable, that he intended, in his own time and at her pleasure, to make her an offer of marriage, and that he would take it very ill if any obstacle were placed in the lady's way, or any diminishment of her comfort visited upon her, on account of a connection that did her nothing but honour. It was a generous speech and a clumsy one, and it had precisely the wrong effect, for Sir Marmaduke, terrified of the Duke and more terrified of his wife, repeated every word of it to Lady Prudence within the hour, and Lady Prudence, who had already resolved on Marianne's destruction, now understood exactly how little time she had, and how high the stakes, and laid her plans with a new and desperate haste. Marianne, When she learned of the Duke's call, and she learned of it from Lady Prudence's own newly sweetened lips, which should have warned her and did trouble her, though she could not yet see why was not pleased, as a foolish woman would have been pleased, she was frightened. She sought the Duke out at the milestone the next morning, and she was pale, and she said, "You went to Sir Marmaduke. You told him you meant to marry me." "I did." Julian is the first time she had used his name to his face, and she did not seem to notice she had done it, which told him more than the word itself. "You should not have. You have made it real now, in the world where it can be taken from us. While it was only a thing between us at a milestone, it was safe no one could spoil a thing they did not know existed. Now they know. Now Lady Prudence knows you are in earnest. Do you understand what she is? You do not. You have never been poor and dependent and hated by a clever woman under whose roof you must sleep every night. I have. She smiles at me now, Julian. This past week she has been all kindness. She has given me silk. She has praised me before company. She means to bring me forward. And I have been fool enough to half believe it, 'cause I am starved for a little warmth, and she knows it, and a starving woman is easy to feed poison. But I lay awake last night, and I thought, Prudence Vane has never in 12 years given me a kind word she did not want something for. She wants something now. I do not yet know what. But you have put a weapon in her hand by declaring yourself, and I am afraid. The Duke of Oxley, who had faced down the lords and stared down half the peerage, looked at the fear in her clear grey eyes and felt some cold move through him. He should have listened. He would spend a long time afterward wishing he had listened. But he was a duke, and dukes are not accustomed to being afraid of a baronet's wife, and the old armour spoke through him and made him confident where he should have been wary. "Marianne," he said gently, "you have lived so long among people who could hurt you that you see a knife in every kindness. I do not doubt Lady Prudence is a spiteful woman, but she cannot touch you now. You are under my protection. Whatever she attempts, I am 15 miles away, and I will not fail you. Let her scheme. Her schemes are nothing against the truth, and the truth is that I love you, and I mean to marry you, and there is not a thing on this earth she can do to alter it. There is not a thing on this earth she can do to alter it." He would remember saying that. He would remember the particular arrogance of it, the arrogance of a man who has never been powerless and cannot truly imagine it, and he would be sick with the memory later. At the milestone she stood at alone, but that morning she let herself, against her own better wisdom, be a little comforted. She wanted so much to believe him. She had spent 12 years being right about how the world would treat her, and being right had been a cold and lonely victory, and here was a man asking her to be wrong for once, to trust, to hope, to believe that the truth was strong enough to protect her. And she was so tired, under all her hard-won strength, of being right and alone. So she let him hold her hands there in the greening spring longer than was proper, and she let herself lean, for one moment, the smallest degree of her weight against the certainty in his voice, and she said, "I want to believe you. God help me, I do want to." And the Duke of Oxley drew her hand to his lips and kissed her chilled fingers, the first time he had ever done so, and felt her breath catch, and thought himself the most fortunate man in England. They spoke, that morning and the few mornings that followed before the trap closed, of the life they might have. He told her of Oxley, of the 200 rooms he had rattled around in alone, of the library gone to dust, of the nursery that had stood empty and shrouded since own childhood. He told her he did not want a grand duchess who would fill the house with fashionable company. He wanted the woman who carried baskets in the frost, and he meant her to go on carrying them, to Oxley tenants now, and to fill the dead library with argument, and the dead nursery with life. And to sit across from him of an evening and disagree with him about history, and Marianne, listening, let herself for the first time in 12 years imagine a future that was not merely a longer corridor of the same dark corner, let herself picture a room with candles she need not save, and books she need not read half the night in secret, and a man across the fire who wanted her thoughts and not her usefulness, and the picture was so bright and so unfamiliar that it frightened her more than any of Lady Prudence's smiles, because she understood that she had begun at last truly to hope, and that a woman with nothing who begins has given a hostage to fortune, and that fortune, in her long experience, was not kind to hostages. She was right about that. She was right about everything, and within the week the blue silk gown was made, and the smooth stranger car had come courting, and the conservatory door stood waiting to be opened, and the Duke of Oxley's arrogant certainty there is not a thing on this earth she can do to alter it was about to be broken across the exact old wound he had never told her he carried. The lie that Lady Prudence Vane devised was a patient and a clever one, and she laid it as one lays a snare, with care for the ground. She began by befriending Marianne. It was so unexpected, a thing so wholly unlike 13 years of chill, that Marianne, who was wise about cruelty but had little practice in reading kindness, was slow to distrust it. Lady Prudence grew warm. She spoke of dear Marianne to visitors. She gave her a length of good blue silk and had it made into a gown, and stood Marianne before the glass and told her, with every appearance of sisterly feeling, that she had never given the girl her due, that the Duke's attentions had opened her eyes, that of course Marianne must be brought forward now and given her chance at happiness. And Marianne, wanting to believe it, wanting, after 13 years, to believe that the frost was truly going out of the house that held her, let the blue silk gown be made, and let herself be brought forward, and did not see the shape of the snare closing until it had very nearly shut. For into this new warmth Lady Prudence introduced a gentleman, a Mr. Rowley Carr, a smooth, handsome, plausible man of 35, lately come into the neighbourhood, who was in fact deep in Lady Prudence's debt and deeper in her scheme, and whose commission was simple. He was to court Marianne Aldsworth. He was to be seen courting her, publicly, warmly, persistently, so that when the moment came it might be made to appear that the poor grateful spinster, dazzled at last by a little attention, had welcomed the addresses of a man of her own modest station, and that whatever she had shared with the Duke of Oxley, she had thrown it over the instant a nearer, easier prospect offered. Lady Prudence did not need Marianne to love Mr. Carr. She only needed the Duke to believe that Marianne might, and she engineered the tableau with a genius for cruelty, on the evening of a large assembly, the largest of the young season, at which the Duke of Oxley was certain to be present. Lady Prudence contrived that Mr. Carr should draw Marianne aside into the conservatory, on the innocent pretext of showing her a rare night-blooming flower she had spoken of wishing to see. There, in the green dark among the orange trees, Mr. Carr was to make her a warm and pressing declaration, and Lady Prudence would take care that the Duke of Oxley should be walking that way at that hour, and should come upon the two of them close together in the shadowed conservatory. The handsome man bent low over the poor relation's hand and should draw, as any man in the world would draw, the conclusion he was meant to draw. It fell out nearly as she planned. Marianne, suspecting nothing, went to see the flower. Mr. Carr, all charm, spoke of it, and then of her, and then, clumsy in his eagerness, or perhaps grown to half believe his own part, he seized her hand and pressed it, and began upon a declaration of feeling that Marianne, startled and then swiftly cold, was in the very act of freezing with a few level words when the conservatory door opened, and the Duke of Oxley stood framed against the light of the ballroom beyond, and saw them. He saw a man he did not know bent close over Marianne's hand in the intimate green dark. He saw her turn toward the fellow, her face, though he could not read it at that distance, in that light lifted to his. He heard the low murmur of the man's voice break off, and the Duke of Oxley, who had spent 17 years being pursued for his fortune and lied to for his advantage, who carried beneath all his granite a wound he never spoke of, for there had been, long ago, when he was young, a woman who had sworn she loved him and had wanted only his title, and the discovery of it had been the making of the shut cold man the world now feared. The Duke of Oxley felt that old wound tear open, and felt the whole terrible weight of his practised distrust come crashing down, and thought in one black instant, I am a fool. She is like all the rest. She wanted a life any man's warm hand would have served. I only came first with the largest fortune, and now that a nearer prospect. He did not finish the thought, he was already gone. He turned on his heel without a word and walked out through the ballroom, past the watching Lady Prudence, whose sweet face hid a savage triumph, and out into the night and up into his carriage, and he did not answer when Marianne, who had wrenched her hand free of Mr. Carr and understood the whole horror of the trap in a single sick heartbeat, came running to the conservatory door and out into the dark, calling his name. The carriage was gone. She stood on the gravel in her blue silk gown with the cold coming up off the stones, and she understood exactly what had happened, and exactly how it had been done, and exactly how it would look. And she understood with the terrible clear-sightedness of a woman who had spent 13 years studying how the world diminished her, that there was no explaining it. Explanation was a luxury for people the world was inclined to believe. A poor relation caught in a conservatory with a man's lips at her hand did not get to explain. She got to be believed guilty, because it was easier and more amusing to believe her guilty, and because everyone had always known, had they not, that the Duke's interest was a passing madness and the drudge was a drudge after all. Lady Prudence's revenge went further even than the conservatory. Within 2 days there were letters, anonymous letters in a disguised hand, sent to the Duke of Oxley at his great house, letters full of poisoned insinuation, purporting to reveal that Miss Aldsworth had been trifling with the Duke, from the first out of pure calculation, that she had boasted below stairs of the fine match she meant to make, that the whole modest, honest, basket-carrying goodness of her was a long, patient performance staged to catch precisely such a fish as he. It was all false. It was cunningly built of half-truths and household gossip twisted just enough. And the Duke of Oxley, sitting alone in his study at Oxley with the letters spread before him and his old wound bleeding, read them, and did not at first know how to disbelieve them, because they told him the thing he had spent 17 years bracing to be told, that he had let himself be loved for the wrong reasons again, and had been a fool again, and that the one honest thing he had ever found had been the cleverest lie of all. He did not go to the milestone. 3 mornings running, Marianne Aldsworth walked up the Hulbury Road in the young spring light, and stood at the old milestone with the beeches greening over her head, and waited, and the Duke of Oxley did not come. She did not weep. She had long ago spent the tears that such things were worth. She stood the full hour each morning, because she had said she would prove herself with time and would not be the first to break faith even now, and on the 3rd morning, when he did not come, she walked home and folded the blue silk gown into the bottom of her trunk and put on her mended grey and her invisibility, and went back to her corner and her baskets and her accounts, and told herself, in the small, cold, private country of her own thoughts, that she had always known, and that it was better to have known briefly what being seen was like than never to have known it at all, and that she would survive this the way she had survived everything, quietly. But it is one thing to be invisible before one has been seen, and quite another to be made invisible again after. The corner that had been her comfort was a coffin now. She had let the door stand open, and the world had walked in and looted the room and gone, and left the door swinging. And Marianne Aldsworth, who had built her whole life on the hard, sane refusal to hope, found that she had been wrong about only one thing. She had believed the second learning of invisibility would take another 13 years. It did not. It took 3 mornings at an empty milestone. And she thought, packing away the blue silk, that this was the cruelest arithmetic of all, that the more truly a person is seen, the more completely they can afterward be erased. To understand why the Duke of Oxley believed the lie, so readily why 9 days of poison could undo 3 months of the truest happiness he had ever known, one must understand the wound he never spoke of, the wound that had made him the shut cold man the county feared, and that Lady Prudence Vane, for all her cunning, had struck without even knowing it was there. He had been 23 and new to the title, and young in a way he could scarcely now remember being, when he had loved a woman named Sophia Vale. She had been beautiful and clever at seeming kind, and she had told him she loved him, and he had believed her with the whole undefended heart of a young man who has not yet learned that a great fortune makes a man a target long before it makes him a prize. He had been on the point of marrying her. He had bought the ring, and then, by the merest chance, a letter left unfolded, a confidence overheard through a half-open door at a house party, he had learned the truth, that Sophia Vale did not love him and never had, that she had wept over his supposed dullness to her own sister and her own maid, that she meant to marry the Duke of Oxley for his acres and his consequence, and to be rid of him in every way that mattered, the moment the ring was on her finger, that the tenderness he had drunk down like a starving man had been, from the first word to the last, a performance staged for his fortune. It had very nearly destroyed him. He had been young enough to have believed entirely, and so he was hurt entirely, and out of that hurt, over the years that followed, he had built the armor. He had resolved never again to be a fool. He had learned to read the machinery behind every smile, to assume calculation until it was disproved, to keep his own heart in a locked room where no fortune hunter could reach it, and it had worked. In 17 years no woman had touched him, because he had let none near enough. He had grown formidable and cold and safe, and desperately, unspeakably lonely, and had called the loneliness wisdom. This was the man Marianne Aldsworth had walked past all his defences in a single evening, not by storming them, but by so plainly not wanting anything from him that the machinery he was forever watching for simply was not there. She had asked him to go away. She had begged him to marry an heiress. A fortune hunter does not do this, and so for 3 months the Duke's vigilance had found nothing to fear, and the locked room had stood open, and he had been happy. But an old wound does not heal merely because it has been long quiet. It waits. And Lady Prudence Vane's plot had been built by accident, for she knew nothing of Sophia Vale, but with the devil's own aim nonetheless to strike that exact old wound at that exact old place. A staged scene, a woman he loved, apparently false. A warm murmuring man where he had thought only he had access. Anonymous letters telling him, in a dozen cunning ways, the precise thing Sophia Vale had proven true 17 years before, that he had let himself be loved for his fortune, that the tenderness was a performance, that he had been, after all, a fool again. It was as though the trap had been designed by someone who knew the shape of the scar, and had laid the whip exactly across it. Lady Prudence had not known, but the old wound had, and it had done the rest. That was why, standing in the doorway of the conservatory and seeing Rowley Carr bent over Marianne's hand, the Duke of Oxley had not walked forward to ask what he saw, as a whole man would have done. He had turned and fled, because the frightened 23-year-old who still lived inside the formidable Duke had seen Sophia Vale in the green dark and had run from her before she could speak, exactly as he had wished, 17 years too late, that he had run from Sophia Vale. The flight had not been about Marianne at all. It had been about a ghost, and the tragedy of it the thing the Duke would understand only later, sitting among the poisoned letters in the dark, was that the very depth of his love for Marianne was what had made the wound so quick to open. He had let her all the way in. He had taken the armour off, and a man with the armour off can be struck to the heart in a way that a man safely locked away never can. He understood this in the 9th-day clarity that old Hartley's question had opened in him, and understanding it did not excuse him, but it did explain him, and the explanation was itself a kind of terrible gift. For he saw that the fear which had made him fail Marianne was the same fear that had governed his whole barren life, that had cost him 17 years and would now, if he let it, cost him the one thing worth having, and he saw that he had a choice at last, that he had never truly faced before. He could go back into the locked room. He could tell himself, as he had told himself for a fortnight, that he had had a narrow escape, that trust was folly, that the armour was wisdom, and he could live out the rest of his days safe and cold and alone in his 200 rooms, and never be hurt again, and never be alive again, either. Or he could do the harder, more frightening thing. He could name the fear for what was a boy's old terror, not a man's true judgment, and he could walk out of the locked room forever, and risk the whole of his heart on the truth of a woman who had never once lied to him, and take the consequences, whatever they were. He thought of Sophia Vale, whom he had not thought of in years. He thought of how she had performed her love, and how he had learned, over 17 bitter years, the difference between the performance and the real thing. Learned it, he now saw, precisely so that he might one day recognize the real thing when at last it stood before him in a corner in mended grey. Marianne had never performed, not once, not at the ball, not at the milestone, not in the conservatory, not anywhere. Everything about her that the world despised, her plainness, her poverty, her silence, her refusal to charm, was the very proof of her truth, the very opposite of everything Sophia Vale had been. Sophia had been all surface and no depth. Marianne was all depth and had never been permitted a surface. He had spent 17 years frightened of the wrong woman, and had nearly let the fear cost him the right one. The Duke of Oxley rose from among the poisoned letters, and he understood that Lady Prudence Vane, in trying to destroy him, had in the end done him the one service no one else could have done, She had reached in and torn open the old wound one final time, and forced him to look at it, and shown him that it had been governing him for 17 years, and given him thereby the chance to be free of it at last. He would not waste the chance. He would ride out and find the truth, and he would clear Marianne's name, and he would ask her to be his wife, and he would do it not as the safe, cold Duke, but as the man he might have been all along if a girl named Sophia Vale had never taught him to be afraid. It was late to learn to be that man. He was 39 and had wasted the best years of his heart in a locked room, but it was not too late. He gathered up the poisoned letters and the true account beside them, and he went out to have his horse saddled, and for the first time in 17 years the Duke of Oxley was not afraid of what loving someone might cost him. He was only afraid, now, of the far greater cost of not. The Duke of Oxley did not see Marianne Aldsworth in the days that his cousin gathered the proofs of Lady Prudence's plot. He judged, rightly, that he had no right to go to her until he could go with the whole truth in his hand and his shame laid bare. And that to appear at the milestone before then, half-informed and still stained with his own failure, would be only to ask her forgiveness before he had earned the smallest right to it. And so he did not know, could not know, being 15 miles away and buried in the cold work of vindication, what those same days were to the woman he had abandoned. He would learn it later, some of it from her own reluctant telling, and some of it from the tenants. And it would be among the things he carried in his heart to the end of his days, the account of how Marianne Aldsworth bore her dark hour, alone, in a house that had never given her one kind thing she had not paid for. She had understood the trap the instant it sprang. Standing in the conservatory with Carr's hired warmth going cold on her wrenched-away hand, watching the Duke's back disappear into the ballroom's light, she had not needed a single word of explanation. She had read the whole design at a glance, the flower, the timing, the smooth stranger, Lady Prudence's sudden kindness, the blue silk that was to be her wedding to a lie, the way she read a falling tray, in half a second complete. And she had run after him into the dark, and the carriage had been gone, and she had stood on the cold gravel and known, with the terrible clear-sightedness that 12 years of studying her own diminishment had taught her, that there would be no explaining it, and no undoing it, and no help. She had not wept on the gravel. She had gone inside and up the back stairs and past the ballroom where Lady Prudence held her savage triumph, and she had folded the blue silk gown into the bottom of her trunk and put on her mended grey, and she had gone back to the accounts. Because the accounts were due and no one else would do them, and because she found that the surest way to survive a night that wished to break her was to make her hands busy with a small necessary thing. She had balanced the Halberry books by candlelight while below her the ball she was not permitted to attend spun on, and her figures had not once gone wrong, and this small competence had been, that night, the last plank she had to stand on above the dark water, and she had stood on it. 3 mornings she went to the milestone. She has never been able to say afterward quite why she went, when she knew she was certain she knew that he would not come, when going was only to lay her own heart on the anvil for the world to strike again. Perhaps it was that she had told him she would prove herself with time, and she would not be the one to break faith, even at an empty milestone, even alone, even when faith was surely wasted. Perhaps it was that hope, once truly wakened after 12 years of sleep, does not go quietly back to bed, but goes on rising each grey morning and walking up the road to stand under the greening beeches and wait, long after the mind has told it there is nothing to wait for. She stood the full hour each morning. She watched the frost melt off the milestone. She did not weep. And each morning, when the hour was done and he had not come, she walked home and told herself, in the small cold private country of her thoughts, that she had always known, and that she would survive this the way she had survived everything, quietly. But the survival was harder than any survival she had yet been asked for, and there were hours in those days when she was not sure of it. For she had learned the cruelest lesson of her whole life, and it was this, that to be seen and then unseen is a wound of a different and deeper kind than never to have been seen at all. In her 12 years of invisibility she had made a peace, a real if joyless peace, with being nothing to anyone. She had furnished her dark corner and called it home, and had not been unhappy, exactly, only unlit. But now the corner had been opened to the sun, and the sun had gone, and the corner that had been shelter was a grave. She could no longer not want to be seen, She had tasted it, and the taste would not leave her. She would have to go on living in the corner now, knowing what the sun had felt like on her face, and that she found, standing at the empty milestone on the third morning, was very nearly more than a person could bear. And there was worse than the grief, which she might have borne alone. There was the daily triumph of her enemy, which she had to bear before witnesses. For Lady Prudence Vane, victorious, did not trouble to hide it. The false warmth was gone, the silk was reclaimed, and in its place came a new and terrible sweetness, the sweetness of a cat that has cornered a bird and has all the time in the world. Lady Prudence spoke of the Duke at dinner, before the family and any guests, of how his madness had passed, how sensible he had grown, how she had always known his interest in poor Marianne was a passing whim, and had said so from the first. She spoke of it looking at Marianne, smiling, watching for the flinch, and Marianne, seated below the salt in her mended grey with her face schooled to perfect patient nothing, gave her no flinch, not one, though it cost her more than the whole 12 years together to withhold it. She sat, and she said nothing, and she reached in the depths of herself for the one thing that Lady Prudence Vane could not take from her, which was the truth that she knew what she had been, and what she had done, and that no lie, however successful, could make her in her own soul the schemer they said she was. She had held that truth all her life against a world that denied it. She held it now. It was cold comfort, and it was the only comfort she had, and it was enough, barely, to keep her standing. Little Tom, the youngest of Cecil's children, who was 6 and loved his Aunt Marianne with the whole undivided heart of a child who has not yet been taught rank, found her one evening sitting alone in the dark schoolroom, not crying, only sitting very still with her hands folded, and he climbed into her lap without asking, as he had always been allowed to do, and put his arms around her neck and said, "Aunt Mari, why are you sad?" And Marianne, who had not wept once through the whole of her dark hour, not on the gravel, not at the milestone, not under Lady Prudence's smiling cruelty, held the small warm weight of the one creature in that house her without calculation, and felt the tears come, and let them silently into the child's soft hair, and said, "I am not sad, my darling, I am only tired." Grown people grow tired, sometimes, of being brave, and little Tom, not understanding, patted her cheek with a fat hand and said she must not be tired, because he loved her, and Marianne held him tighter and thought that this small unbought love, given freely by a creature the world had not yet taught to withhold, it was the truest thing she had, and that whatever else was taken from her, she had done at least this much good in the world, that a child would climb into her lap in the dark and try to comfort her, and that no Lady Prudence Vane and no fleeing Duke could ever unmake it. And she dried her eyes, and carried the sleeping child up to his bed, and went back to her corner, and endured. She did not know, she could not have imagined that 15 miles away, that very night, the Duke of Oxley was reading the confessions of a paid groom, and comparing a forged hand against a household list, and folding a true account against his heart, and giving orders for a state carriage and his best clothes and a message to Halbury House, that the son she had believed gone forever was, at that hour, turning back up the road toward her, that her dark hour was very nearly its darkest, which is to say very nearly done. She knew only the corner, and the cold, and the cruel arithmetic she had proven twice over now, that the more truly a person is seen, the more completely she can afterward be erased. She had learned it, she believed, for the last time. She was wrong about that too, as she had been wrong about only one thing her whole hard, clear-sighted life. She had believed the erasure would be permanent. It had 4 days left to run. The Duke of Oxley spent 9 days in the dark. He did not go to the milestone, and he did not answer the letters, and he did not leave his house. He sat in his study among the poisoned pages and drank more than a wise man drinks, and let the old wound do its old work, which was to persuade him that trust was a weakness he had briefly and shamefully indulged, and that the shut cold armor was the only sane way for a man of his fortune to live. He told himself he had had a narrow escape. He told himself he ought to be grateful to whoever had sent the letters. He told himself a great many wise, bitter, self-protecting things, and he believed almost all of them for 9 days. On the 9th day his old butler, Hartley, who had served 3 Dukes of Oxley, and had earned across half a century the right to speak plainly when speaking plainly was needed, came into the study to draw the curtains against the evening, and stopped and looked at his master among the bottles and the letters. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but I have been 50 years in this house, and I have watched you grow from a boy into the loneliest man I ever served, and I never once presumed to speak of it, because it was not my place. But you have been happy these 3 months, Your Grace. I have seen it. The whole house has seen it. You have whistled on the stairs like your father before the grief took him. And now you sit here in the dark believing something that has broken you, and I find I cannot draw the curtains and hold my tongue, because I am an old man and shall not have many more chances to say a true thing. So I will ask you one question, Your Grace, and then I will draw the curtains and trouble you no further." He paused. "The letters you sit over, are they in the hand of the lady who carries bats to the tenants, and sends you feathers and old tiles and marginal notes that make you laugh alone in this room? Or are they in some other hand, sent by some other person, who wished you to believe a thing about her? Because in 50 years, Your Grace, I have learned that when a slanderer troubles to write a letter, it is not the person slandered you should study, it is the person who profits." And then old Hartley drew the curtains and bowed and went out, and left the Duke of Oxley alone with a question that went through his fog like a lamp carried into a dark room. "It is not the person slandered you should study, it is the person who profits." The Duke sat very still. And slowly, terribly with the cold clarity of a man sobering all at once, he began to think not with his old wound, which felt, but with his mind which had made him formidable in the Lords before he grew too weary to trouble. Who profited? Not Marianne. Man, had she wished to catch him, had held every card and thrown them all away. She had refused him at the milestone, had asked him to prove himself with time, had begged him to go home and marry an heiress, had sung to a room that despised her about the anguish of waiting rather than throw herself at his fortune. A calculating woman does not behave so. A calculating woman does not carry broth to lung-fevered cottagers on frozen mornings when no one of consequence is watching. He had seen her, through a cottage window, take a sick woman's chapped hand in both of hers unseen, unrewarded, unwitnessed by any soul who could advance her. That was not performance. He had built his whole delight in her on the certainty that it was not performance, and 9 days of poison had made him forget the plainest evidence of his own eyes. Who profited? He thought of the conservatory. He thought of how conveniently he had happened to walk that way. He thought of Lady Prudence Vane's sweet-curdled smile as he passed her going out. He thought of a smooth, plausible stranger named Carr whom no one seemed to know, come from nowhere into the neighbourhood, courting the one penniless woman in 3 counties who had nothing to offer a fortune hunter, which made no sense at all, unless the courtship itself was the point, unless it had been arranged to be seen. And he thought of the letters, so cunningly built, arriving so promptly, telling him so precisely the thing his old wound was primed to believe. A woman who wished to catch a duke does not first beg him to go away, but a woman who wishes to destroy a rival does exactly this. The Duke of Oxley rose from his chair, and he was no longer drunk, and he was no longer in the dark. He was in a cold, white fury the like of which he had not felt in 17 years, a fury at Lady Prudence Vane, and at the man Carr, and above all, most terribly at himself, at the frightened, self-protecting, cowardly part of himself that had been so ready to believe the worst of the one good thing he had ever found, because believing the worst had been safer than risking the best. Marianne had asked him for one thing. She had asked him to prove himself with time, to be worthy, not to pick her up only to set her down, and at the first shadow, the first cunning shadow thrown across her by an enemy, he had set her down. He had abandoned her an empty milestone for 9 mornings. He had done to her the very thing she had feared above all others and had begged him not to do. He was ashamed as he had never been ashamed in his life, and shame in a strong man, when it turns at last to purpose, is a terrible engine. He sent for his fastest horse and rode through the night to the house of the only man he trusted entirely, his cousin and man of business, and he set that man to work. He wanted the truth of Rowley Carr, who he was, what he owed, and to whom. He wanted the letters compared discreetly against samples of certain hands. He wanted the Halberry servants questioned, gently and for good coin, about a certain groom and a certain scheme, and who below stairs had been paid to say what. He wanted everything, and he wanted it fast. and he had the fortune to command it and the fury to drive it, and within a se'night he had it all. Rowley Carr was a broken gamester who owed Lady Prudence Vane £400 and had been forgiven the debt in exchange for a fortnight's courtship of a woman he had never met. The disguised hand of the anonymous letters, set beside a household list Lady Prudence had once written in her own careless fist, matched in a dozen small betraying turns the cramped R, the looping D closely enough to satisfy the Duke, who had learned to read a document as another man reads a face. And the groom who had first carried the tale of the milestone to the great house, and two of the kitchen maids besides, when they understood that the great Duke of Oxley himself desired the truth and would reward it and shield them, told all, how her ladyship had planned the conservatory, how she had timed his walk, how she had crowed to her own maid that she would put the drudge back in her corner if it took her every farthing and every friend. The Duke of Oxley read it all through twice, in the cold grey light of his study, with the poisoned letters and the true account side by side upon the desk. Then he folded the true account and put it in his breast, over his heart. And he stood a long time at the window looking out over the bare park of Oxley toward the country where a woman in mended grey was, at that hour, carrying a basket up a frozen lane and teaching herself all over again not to hope. He had thrown away, out of fear, the one thing his fortune could not buy. He did not know whether she would ever forgive him. He would not have blamed her if she never did. He had earned no forgiveness. But he found that this no longer governed him. He had spent 17 years arranging his life around the avoidance of pain, around never being made a fool, never being wanted for his acres, never letting the armour off. It had brought him 200 empty rooms and a silence he had mistaken for peace. And 9 days in the dark that had nearly cost him his soul. He was done arranging his life around fear. Whether she forgave him or not, he would do the one thing left that a man in his position could do. He would make the truth as public as the lie had been. He would take the shame that was his and lay it down where the whole watching world could see it, and he would clear her name in the same glittering rooms where it had been blackened, and he would ask her before all of them, with no corner left for either of them to hide in, to be his wife. And if she refused him, as she had every right to do, then he would at least have paid, in public and in full, the debt his cowardice owed to her courage. He rang for Hartley, and when the old man came, the Duke of Oxley looked at him with clear eyes for the first time in a fortnight and said, "You were right, Hartley. It was the one who profited. Have my best clothes made ready, and the state carriage, and send word to Halbury House that the Duke of Oxley will attend Lady Prudence Vane's spring ball, and will bring the whole county with him. I have a thing to say, and I mean to say it where it was unsaid, and I do not mean to say it quietly." The spring ball at Halbury House was the grandest the family had given in 20 years, for the whole county had learned that the Duke of Oxley would attend, and no one who could beg, borrow, or claim an invitation stayed away. The great gilded ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, the chandeliers dripped fire, the cream of 3 shires turned out in silk and diamonds, and Lady Prudence Vane stood at the head of her own staircase in triumph, believing herself entirely victorious. The Duke had, she was certain, come to his senses. He had not been near the drudge in a fortnight. He had accepted her invitation like a reasonable man returned to his proper world, and tonight she meant he should be brought together at last with her niece Arabella, and the whole tiresome madness of the poor relation should be buried under a golden girl and a good marriage. As for Marianne, Lady Prudence had ordered her kept upstairs at the accounts, out of sight, invisible back, at last in her corner. But Lady Prudence had made one error. She had summoned the whole county, and when the whole county is summoned, one cannot easily choose whom it contains. The Duke of Oxley arrived late, when the rooms were full, and he came not as a suitor, but as a force. He was dressed with a severe magnificence that silenced the room as he entered. He wore no smile. His dark eyes swept the ballroom once, and did not find the face they sought, and hardened. He made his bow to Lady Prudence with a courtesy so cold that her triumph faltered at the edges. And then, before she could steer him toward Arabella, before the music could cover him, the Duke of Oxley turned from his hostess and walked to the centre of that vast blazing floor, and he stopped, and in a voice pitched to fill a chamber of Parliament he said, "My lords, ladies, gentlemen, forgive me, I am about to be very ill-bred, and I find I do not care. The room went utterly still. I came into this county some months ago to be bored, as I have been bored in every room these 17 years. In this house, at a ball much like this one, I met a lady whom you all know, and whom you have all, for a dozen years, been pleased to call the spinster aunt. A murmur, sharp and shocked, ran round the walls. You called her useful. You called her invisible. You laughed, some of you, when I gave her my arm. I have come tonight to tell you what she is, and what has been done to her under this roof, and I will have every soul in this room hear it, for it was in rooms exactly like this one that the lie was told, and it is in this room that it will die. Lady Prudence had gone the colour of ash. She started forward, some bright false protest half formed on her lips, but the Duke turned his eyes on her, and the protest died, for there is a kind of cold in a powerful man's face that no lie can survive. There was a plot, said the Duke of Oxley, and he drew from his breast the folded true account, to persuade me, by a staged scene and a set of forged and anonymous letters, that the lady I honoured was false. A gentleman was hired ladies, his debt of £400 forgiven in exchange to court her before witnesses that I might be made to see it and believe the worst, and I confess to my lasting shame that for 9 days I did believe it. I, who pride myself on reading men, was played like a green boy by a spite I should have seen. I abandoned an honest woman on the strength of a slander, and I have come here tonight to say so before you all, and to name the truth, and to name his eyes when again, level and terrible, to the head of the room, the one who profited by the lie. He did not, in the end, need to speak the name. The room's own eyes had already found her. Lady Prudence Vane stood pilloried by 500 candles and 100 turning faces, and every soul present understood, in the space of a breath, exactly what had been done and by whom, for the Duke had marshalled his facts as he had once marshalled a bill through the Lords, and he laid them out now, one after another, cold and unanswerable. The debt, the hired man, the timed walk to the conservatory, the letters in a disguised hand that a dozen small betraying strokes tied to her ladyship's own, the servants who had been paid and had confessed. It took perhaps 4 minutes. By the end of it, Lady Prudence Vane had not one friend left standing near her. The county had drawn away from her along the walls as though from a plague, and her own husband, red and stammering and appalled, had stepped back from his wife's side. The cruel were humbled, wholly and publicly, and past all mending, and they humbled themselves further with every false word they tried, until at last Lady Prudence, undone, fled the room she had meant to rule, and the smooth man car had long since vanished into the night, and it was over. But the Duke of Oxley was not finished. He turned from the ruin he had made, and his voice changed, the cold going out of it, something else coming into it, something the county had certainly never heard from that shut granite man before, and he said, "Where is she? Send for her. I know she has been kept upstairs. Send for Miss Aldsworth. I will not say the rest of what I have to say without her." And so they sent, and the room waited, 500 people in silk holding their breath, and presently there was a stir at the door, and Marianne Aldsworth came down the great staircase into the ballroom. She had not been told what waited below. She had been fetched from the accounts in her mended grey, ink still on her fingers, and she came into the blaze of the ballroom pale and braced, her chin up in the old brave habitual way, expecting fresh humiliation, expecting the corner, expecting the world to be the world. And she saw instead 500 faces turned toward her, not in scorn, but in a kind of awed shame, and she saw the wreck of Lady Prudence's triumph, and she saw, standing alone in the centre of that vast bright floor, with his careful shut face entirely open and his heart in his eyes, the Duke of Oxley waiting for her. She stopped on the stair. He came to the foot of it, and the Duke of Oxley, 9th of his name, the greatest prize in England, before the assembled cream of 3 shires, went down all the way down, on one knee, on the marble at the foot of the Halberry staircase, in a gesture so unheard of that a woman near the wall gave a small cry and pressed her hand to her mouth. "Marianne," he said, and he did not trouble to pitch it low now. He let the whole room have it. "I have wronged you. I let a lie do what all your enemies together could never have done. Let it make me leave you at the milestone, which is the one thing on this earth you asked me never to do. I have no excuse. I was a coward, and I was afraid, because I have been wanted for my acres all my life and never once for myself. And when the lie told me you were like all the rest, some frightened part of me believed it, because to believe it was safer than to trust the best thing that has ever happened to me. I am done being safe. I have stood in 200 empty rooms for 17 years, calling the silence peace. And it was not peace, it was only the sound of no one ever knowing me. You knew me. You argued with me and sent me feathers and old tiles and made me laugh alone in a house where I had not laughed in 20 years. And you wanted nothing from me, and you are the truest thing I have ever found, and I threw you away out of fear. And I have come here to throw the fear away instead and beg you, in front of every person who ever called you invisible, to be my wife. The silence in that ballroom was the deepest Marianne Aldsworth had ever stood in. She looked down at him for a long moment, the great Duke on his knee on the marble, ink on her own fingers, 13 years of being invisible standing behind her like a cold country she had lived in all her life. When she spoke, her voice was not quite steady, and it carried, in the utter hush, to every corner of the room. You left me at the milestone, she said. 3 mornings I stood there. Do you know what it is, your grace, to be seen truly seen, as you saw me and then unseen again? It is worse than never having been seen at all. You did that to me. I want you to know that you did that, and that it cost me more than I will ever tell you. I know it, he said. I will spend my life knowing it. I believe you will. She came down one stair and another. I asked you to prove yourself with time, and you failed. And then her voice caught and steadied, and something in her face broke open at last. The long shut door of her small corner swinging wide forever. And then you rode out and dug up the truth, and brought the whole county to watch you kneel, and take the shame that was yours, and clear my name in the very room they blackened it in. No man has ever done 100th part so much for me. No man ever looked at me twice. She was on the last stair now, and there were tears standing bright in her clear grey eyes, and she was at last, in the blaze of 1,000 candles, before all the people who had called her nothing, entirely and unmistakably beautiful. You asked me once what I thought of them, she said, very low, for him alone now. I have thought about it a long while. I find I no longer think of them at all. I think only of you. And then aloud to the whole waiting world, yes, Julian, yes, I will. The Duke of Oxley rose and took the hands of the woman they had called the spinster aunt, and he did not kiss her before that watching room, for he was a private man and this was hers, and instead he lifted her ink-stained fingers to his lips with a tenderness that was somehow more than any kiss. And the ballroom, the same ballroom that had held its breath a season ago at the outrage of a duke walking out with a drudge, broke into an applause that shook the crystal on the chandeliers, an applause of people who had been shown, in a single evening, the difference between what the world prizes and what is truly precious, and were most of them a little ashamed, and all of them moved. They were married in the summer, in the small grey church by Oxley, and it was not a grand wedding, for she did not want one. But the church was full to the doors with tenants, and the cottage woman whose chapped hand Marianne had held through the lung fever wept in the front pew, and old Hartley stood straight as a man of 30 and watched his master marry, at last, out of love, and thought his own long service well rewarded. Lady Prudence Vane left the county before the summer was out, her invitations unanswered, her friends dispersed, ruined by nothing more than the truth she had tried to bury, and the smooth man Carr was never heard of again, and Cecil Vane, to his slow credit, came to the wedding, ashamed and glad at once, and stood a long time afterward holding his aunt's hand and asking, in a low broken voice, why he had ever let them teach him to be ashamed of the best person in his childhood. And the Duke and Duchess of Oxley lived, not in 200 empty rooms, but in a house that filled over the years with light and argument and laughter, and with the small ones she had always mothered come now to a grander nursery, and with feathers and old tiles kept in a drawer of the writing desk and added to every spring, and with tenants who knew their Duchess by name because she still, to the scandalized delight of the county, carried her own baskets in the frost. The world had called her useful and overlooked and invisible for 12 long years and more. It had been wrong about all 3. She had only been waiting, as the old ballad said, waiting through the turning of the seasons for one man to come up the road and see her. He had come. And having seen her once, in a single evening, in the corner of a crowded room, the Duke of Oxley never once, to the end of his long and finally happy life, looked away again. The county, which had been soaked to call Marianne Aldsworth invisible, found that it could not stop looking at the new Duchess of Oxley. It happened slowly over that first year, and it happened against the county's will, for the county had been made to feel foolish and does not forgive being made to feel foolish. But it happened nonetheless, because the truth, once let loose in a room, has a way of not going back into its box. The very people who had laughed at the spinster aunt now found themselves seated at her table, for the Duke of Oxley entertained, that first year, more than he had in the whole 17 years before, opening the great dead house room by room. And no one who valued their standing dared decline an invitation from Oxley, and they found, to their discomfort and then to their slow, reluctant wonder, that the woman they'd despised was the most interesting person any of them had ever dined with. She did not perform, she never had. But she listened, truly listened, in a way that made even foolish people feel briefly worth listening to, and when she spoke, she said things they had not thought of, and said them plainly, without malice and without fear. And she remembered the name of every guest's every child, and asked after them and meant it. And she ran the vast household of Oxley with a quiet mastery that made the old servants worship her within a month, and the great ladies of the county privately, enviously, despair of ever matching. She had managed the Vane estate for 12 years on nothing, in the dark, unthanked, given light and means, and a husband who backed her with the whole weight of a ducal fortune. She was magnificent, and the county, watching, understood at last what the Duke of Oxley had seen in a single evening in a corner, and was ashamed and admired her, and came, in the way of the world, to boast of knowing her. The Duke watched all of this with a deep and private satisfaction. He had not married her to vindicate her before the county. He had married her because he loved her and could not do otherwise and be a whole man. But there was a justice in it that pleased him to the bone, the justice of watching the very rooms that had erased her fill up, night after night, with people straining to earn her notice, of watching the arithmetic that had shrunk her for 12 years run backward at last, and add her up, and find her as he had always known her to be, beyond price. She did not gloat. That was the thing about her that the county found, in the end, hardest to bear and impossible not to respect, that having been raised so high after being cast so low, she showed not a flicker of triumph over any of them. When Arabella Vane, humbled by her aunt's downfall and her family's disgrace, was left without prospects and half forgotten, it was Marianne, Duchess of Oxley, who quietly took the girl up, gave her a season under Oxley's protection, and saw her respectably and even happily married to a decent man, Arabella, who had tittered behind her hand at the pianoforte. When Cecil's fortunes wanted a little help, it was his despised aunt who arranged it, without a word of reproach. For the years he had been ashamed of her, she had been shown no mercy for 12 years, and given the power at last to withhold mercy in her turn, she withheld none. It was not weakness. The Duke, who knew the steel in her, knew it was not weakness. It was that she had decided, long ago in her dark corner, what kind of person she would be regardless of how the world used her, and she was not going to let the world's late apology change that any more than the world's long cruelty had. Only to Lady Prudence Vane did she extend no hand, and that was less mercy withheld than mercy declined, for Lady Prudence, ruined and departed, wanted no kindness from the woman she had tried to destroy, and would have flung it back. Lady Prudence lived out her diminished years in a distant watering place, her name a byword, her friends evaporated, brought low by nothing in the world but the truth she had tried to bury, and if she ever repented no one heard of it, and the Duchess of Oxley, asked once by a tactless guest whether she did not hate the woman, considered the question gravely and answered, "No. I find I have not the room. There is so much I love now, you see. Hatred wants an empty house to live in, and mine is quite full." And the tactless guest repeated it, and it went round the county, and did more to establish the Duchess's greatness than any triumph could have done. The house filled, as the Duke had wished it to fill. The dead library woke. Her books, with their margins, went back among the 3,000, and new books came, and the two of them read of an evening on either side of the same fire, and argued still, deep into the nights, over history and poetry and the follies of the fashionable philosophers. And the arguments never ran dry and never grew cold, because they had been founded, from the very first margin, on the one thing that does not wear out, the pleasure two honest minds take in each other. The shrouded nursery woke too, in its own time. And there were small feet on the great stairs at Oxley, where the Duke had once walked alone, and the Duchess mothered them as she had mothered other people's children for 12 unthanked years. Only now they were her own, and no one could ever take them or teach them to be ashamed of her. And little Tom, who had climbed into her lap in the dark schoolroom and told her he loved her, came often to stay and grew up half at Oxley, and loved her all his life, and named his own eldest daughter after her, and the Duke of Oxley Julian, as only she could. In the private country they now shared, and no longer had to guard found that the thing he had thought himself too old and too armoured ever to feel again had not, after all, been a whim or a novelty, or a passing madness of a bored man in a crowded room. It had been the beginning of his whole real life, arriving late when he had almost stopped hoping for it. He had stood in 200 empty rooms for 17 years and called the silence peace. He knew better now. He knew the difference between the silence of an empty house and the quiet of a full one settling for the night, between a man safe and alone and a man loved and known. He had learned it from a woman in mended grey whom the world had called useful, and overlooked and invisible, for 12 long years and more, and had been wrong about all three. He never forgot how near he had come to losing her, to the old wound, to the fear, to the 9 days in the dark. He kept in a drawer of his writing desk, beside the birch bark and the jay's feather and the bit of old Roman tile, the folded true account that had cleared her name, and now and then, on some grey evening, he would take it out and read it, not for the truth of it, which he no longer needed, but for the reminder that he had once, out of fear, thrown away the best thing in his life and been given by grace and by an old butler's plain question, and by the courage of a woman who had waited an empty milestone rather than break faith, the almost unheard of second chance to take it back. He did not mean to need a third, having seen her once in a single evening in the corner of a crowded room, and having very nearly let the world persuade him he had been mistaken. The Duke of Oxley had learned the one lesson his whole armoured life had failed to teach him: that the rarest thing on this earth is a true heart honestly given, and that a wise man, having found one, does not look away again for anything the world can offer, or threaten, not for pride, not for fear, not for all the golden heiresses in England. He never did look away again. To the end of his long and at the last entirely happy life, whenever the Duke of Oxley entered a crowded room, his eyes went first, always unfailingly, to find one face, and always now it was there, turned toward him, no longer in a corner, no longer in grey, no longer waiting only home. And the world, which had mocked her for 12 years and disbelieved him for one evening, came round at the last, as the world does, to calling it the greatest love match of the age, and forgot that it ever called her anything else at all. But Marianne remembered, and Julian remembered, and neither of them minded the forgetting, for they had the thing itself, which is better than being remembered, and they had it whole, and they had it to the end.